Hey guys, welcome back. Go ahead and dim the lights. Maybe grab a blanket, a cup of tea, or whatever passes for comfort in this economy. Tonight, we're wandering down the narrow, gaslit streets of Victorian London, a city that smelled like coal smoke, horse manure, and moral superiority. It was the age of empire, invention, and industrial grime. The rich were drowning in lace and brandy, and the poor were mostly drowning in, well, everything else. And among the many strange and melancholy trades of this time, rat catchers, chimney sweeps, mudlarks, bone pickers, there was one profession nobody really talks about anymore. The women who cleaned the dead. The layers out, as they were called. Now, the Victorians had an impressive talent for pretending that death was beautiful. They built entire industries around mourning: black crepe, elaborate coffins, horse-drawn hearses with glass windows. But the people actually dealing with the bodies, washing, dressing, and arranging them, were rarely part of the polite conversation. They were essential, invisible, and slightly cursed. So tonight, we're going to lie back and drift into their world. The quiet back rooms, the smell of soap, camphor, and candle wax, the whispered prayers over pale faces, and maybe a few rats scurrying in the walls for ambience. Let's begin. The job title sounds gentle, doesn't it? Layer out of the dead. Almost poetic, like someone carefully tucking in the deceased for an eternal nap. In reality, it was usually performed in tiny, unventilated rooms with minimal lighting and maximum exposure to whatever mysterious diseases the 19th century had to offer. There were no latex gloves, no disinfectants, and certainly no paid sick leave. Layers out were almost always working-class women, widows, midwives, or laundresses, who had learned, through grim necessity, how to handle the dead. Sometimes they were the only women in the neighborhood who could stomach it. Other times, it was simply the only job left when you'd aged out of factory work or domestic service. Payment wasn't generous. You might get a few shillings and a cup of tea for your trouble, or if the family was kind, a slice of bread. If they weren't, well, there's a reason so many of these women were malnourished and half-blind by 40. Let's pause for a moment and picture one of them. She's standing in a small East End room. There's peeling wallpaper, a single candle, and the faint echo of carriage wheels outside. A wooden table serves as her workspace. On it, the body of an elderly man who died 2 nights ago because the doctor never came, and nobody expected him to. Her name could be Mary or Eliza. There were always a few Marys and Elizas. She brings a tin basin of lukewarm water, a rag, and a block of carbolic soap that's seen better days. First, she closes the eyes. That was important. It made the body look peaceful, which mattered to the family, even if the peace was mostly an illusion. Then she straightens the limbs before rigor mortis sets in. A trick learned through grim experience. The washing comes next. Face, hands, torso. Hair combed back neatly. Clothes chosen. Usually the best the family owned, which might still be threadbare and patched. If the dead person was poor, she might have to borrow burial clothes from a neighbor and return them later. You can imagine how that smelled. And through it all, she's quiet, maybe humming, maybe thinking about how to afford coal for the week. Death was just another task, one that paid, occasionally, better than life. Victorian England had an almost obsessive relationship with death. They were terrified of it, fascinated by it, and constantly surrounded by it. Child mortality was high. Epidemics swept through cities like clockwork. People died in their homes, not in hospitals, because hospitals were mostly for the desperate or the condemned. And yet, they ritualized death into something delicate. Funeral cards, hair jewelry, mourning portraits, all the sentimental trimmings that turned grief into art. But behind the lace veils and poetry, someone had to handle the logistics. Someone had to make the corpse look respectable enough to fit into the Victorian fantasy of a good death. That someone, more often than not, was a layer-out. Now there were professional undertakers too, of course, mostly men, in their funereal black suits and tall hats. They managed the coffins and carriages and charged appropriately high prices. But in working-class communities, those formalities were rare luxuries. In the slums of Whitechapel or Southwark, the layer-out was the only funeral service most people could afford. She washed the body, dressed it, arranged it for viewing, and maybe even helped dig the grave if no one else was around. Sometimes she'd stay the night to sit with the dead, ensuring no rats or drunk relatives disturbed the peace. A strange mix of compassion and practicality. Part nurse, part priest, part cleaner. There's a quiet irony here. Victorian society prided itself on moral purity, yet relied on poor women to do its dirtiest, most sacred work. They wanted their dead to look holy, but didn't much care if the woman who made that happen could feed her own children. Let's float over to another room. A wealthier neighbourhood this time, perhaps Bloomsbury. The curtains are drawn, the furniture draped in black. The family is weeping quietly. The layer-out has been called because the lady of the house died after a long illness. Consumption, perhaps. The polite word for tuberculosis. The air smells of lavender oil and decay. This woman, let's call her Mrs. Evans, is more respectable than our friend Eliza from the East End. She might even have her name listed in the parish records as an official layer-out. She brings a box of supplies, brushes, pins, ribbons, a small mirror, and powder to disguise the discoloration of death. She's dressed in mourning black herself, not because she knew the deceased, but because it helps her blend in. Mrs. Evans is paid 2 shillings and 6pence for her work, slightly more than average. She spends hours gently preparing the body, arranging flowers around it, tucking lace around the neck. When the family thanks her, she curtsies, leaves quietly, and walks home through the fog, careful not to attract attention from drunks or constables. And by morning, she'll likely be called to another house, because death in London kept a full schedule. Now, you might wonder, how did someone become a layer-out in the first place? There weren't exactly training programs. It was more of an informal apprenticeship, passed between women who already worked around death, midwives, nurses, or those who'd helped family members in their final hours. You could say birth and death were handled by the same hands. The same women who delivered babies often laid out their mothers or grandmothers later on. It was a full-circle profession, if an unglamorous one. Midwives were especially trusted. They'd been in homes at the most vulnerable moments, and Victorians valued discretion. A good layer-out didn't gossip about the conditions she found or the oddities of the deceased. She was expected to move silently, like a shadow that smelled faintly of camphor. But there were risks. Hygiene wasn't exactly a Victorian strength. Layers out often contracted diseases from the dead. Cholera, typhus, smallpox. Sometimes they got infected through small cuts on their hands. There were no regulations, no protection. In 1848, when cholera hit London hard, some parishes tried to stop women from washing corpses altogether. They feared it spread the disease. Of course, they didn't offer alternative employment or safety equipment. Because why make things easier for working-class women when you can just blame them for public health problems? So many of them continued in secret. Families still needed the dead to be cleaned, and money was money. There's also something quietly spiritual about their work. Victorians believed in the good death, dying at home, surrounded by loved ones, your affairs settled, your face serene. It was the layer-out's job to make that vision possible, even if the reality had been messy or violent or lonely. Some women would place coins over the eyes, a folk habit meant to keep them closed and to pay the ferryman in the next world. Others would cross the hands neatly over the chest and whisper a prayer, whether they believed in it or not. One 19th century manual for the proper duties of women actually described corpse preparation as an act of feminine charity, which is a polite way of saying, we don't want to do it, but someone has to, and it might as well be you. The class divide is what makes this story so interesting and so bleak. For the wealthy, death was a ceremony. For the poor, it was a household chore. And yet the same society that built ornate cemeteries and wrote flowery obituaries refused to pay living wages to the women who made all of it possible. There were cases, rare but recorded, of layers out being called thieves if a family noticed a missing ring or brooch. Never mind that many were so hungry they could barely stand while working. Reputation mattered more than survival, and if a woman was accused of stealing from the dead, her career was over. Even if she was innocent, gossip spread fast in crowded neighborhoods. A single rumor could end her livelihood. By the late 1800s, things started to change, slowly, unevenly, and not necessarily for the better. The funeral industry professionalized. Undertakers expanded their services to include washing and dressing bodies. Middle-class families preferred the appearance of respectability over the familiarity of local women. In short, men took over. The quiet, domestic art of laying out the dead became a business, and like most professions, absorbed.
By men, it suddenly gained status and doubled in price. Layers out faded from notice. By the early 20th century, they were almost gone, remembered only in local folklore and parish records. But for decades, they had been an essential presence in London life. The last hands to touch the dead. Let's drift for a moment through those narrow streets again. Imagine the damp fog curling around the lampposts, the quiet of early morning. A woman walks home, her shawl pulled tight, her hands still smelling faintly of soap and candle wax. She's invisible like so many others, laundresses, seamstresses, servants. But every home she passed tonight contained someone she had given a final kindness to. She may not have been remembered in any will or gravestone, but her work lingered in the tidy collars of burial shrouds, in the peaceful faces of the departed, in the silent gratitude of families too poor for marble memorials. Victorian England was obsessed with moral purity and outward respectability. But the real moral labor, the emotional heavy lifting, often fell on women like her. They cleaned up after birth, after sickness, after death. They absorbed the quiet horrors of domestic life so that others could pretend everything was proper and civilized. And yet they rarely appear in history books. Maybe because they remind us that civilization always runs on invisible labor. Someone has to clean the body before the funeral can happen. Someone has to keep the streets livable. And those someones usually aren't wearing corsets and lace gloves. If you're still awake, which is a compliment in this context, you might be realizing that the Victorians' fascination with death wasn't just about grief. It was about control, about packaging death into something that could be managed, prettied up, and sold. Layers Out disrupted that illusion a bit. They worked in private, often alone, facing the raw, unromantic side of mortality. But even they participated in the ritual. They combed hair, straightened limbs, and whispered comfort to families. Not because it was glamorous, but because it was needed. It was their quiet rebellion against the chaos of poverty. Welcome back. If you're still awake, congratulations or condolences. Either way, you've made it past the part where we established that Victorian London was basically a foggy, disease-ridden costume drama with slightly less charm than people remember. Last time, we met the layers out of the dead. Those quiet women who prepared bodies in cramped little rooms while the rest of society politely pretended not to think about mortality. Tonight, we're going a little deeper. We're opening the drawers of their trade, literally and figuratively, to see what tools, tricks, and taboos shaped their strange, vanishing profession. So take another deep breath. Let's wander through another doorway in old London and step into the soft shadows of the mortuary bedroom. We'll start with the basics. What did they actually use? The standard toolkit of a layer out wasn't glamorous. No polished brass instruments or velvet-lined cases here. Mostly, it was what you could carry in a cloth bag. There was the basin, usually tin or enamel, filled with water that might or might not be warm, depending on whether the family could spare coal to heat it. There was the soap, usually carbolic, that sharp-smelling red stuff that burned your skin but made you feel cleaner by sheer force of will. There were rags, a comb, a small mirror to check that the eyes were properly closed, and sometimes a bit of camphor or vinegar to mask the smell. If the woman was lucky or well-practiced, she might also carry a small box of powders or chalk to soften the grayish tone that came with death. A touch of art in an otherwise practical trade. And then there were the pins. Lots of them. They were used to secure the shroud, close the collar, even adjust the expression of the mouth if it needed a little encouragement. Not quite the beauty industry, but not entirely different either. You can imagine the atmosphere. The room quiet except for the dripping of water and the low hum of street sounds outside. The woman works slowly, rhythmically, each movement deliberate, not reverent exactly, but steady, as if she's folding laundry rather than preparing someone for eternity. Victorians loved order, and in a way, this was their final kind of order, the last domestic task after all others had ended. For the layer out, the routine itself might have been comforting. Repetition dulls fear. You stop thinking about what the body used to be and focus on what you need to do next. Wash the face, comb the hair, fold the hands, close the curtains. It's oddly intimate, this work. The last human touch a person receives, and it came from someone society barely acknowledged existed. Let's talk about superstition for a moment, because this is Victorian England after all, where even science had a Gothic flair. The layers out operated in a world steeped in small rituals and half-beliefs. Not quite religion, not quite folklore, something in between. There was the coin on the eyes, as we mentioned before, partly practical, partly symbolic. The practical side was simple. It kept the eyelids shut. The symbolic side? Payment for Charon, the ferryman of the dead, who rowed souls across the river Styx. Because apparently, even in death, You needed exact change. Then there was the clock-stopping ritual. When someone died, the layer-out, or whoever was present, would stop every clock in the room. This was supposed to freeze the moment of death, preventing the soul from getting trapped in time. Or maybe it was just an early version of, let's not get haunted today. Mirrors were another thing. They'd often be covered or turned to the wall while the body was in the house. Victorians believed the soul might get caught in its own reflection, or that the dead could appear in the glass, which frankly would have made anyone stop checking their hair before breakfast. And of course, windows were opened, just a crack, to let the spirit out. Because even though London air was basically poison, the soul needed ventilation. Now, it wasn't just superstition for superstition's sake. These small acts gave a sense of control, a way to make sense of death in a world where medicine couldn't. Cholera, tuberculosis, diphtheria, they struck fast, randomly, and without explanation. Superstition filled the gaps that science hadn't quite figured out yet. And the layers out were the quiet custodians of those customs. They carried them house to house, street to street, decade to decade. It's easy to imagine one of them muttering a little prayer under her breath, not because she believed it would change anything, but because silence made the work heavier. Let's float now into the mid-19th century, when things began to shift. In the 1840s and 1850s, London started to change its relationship with death, or at least with where to put all the dead people. The old churchyards were overcrowded, graves were stacked, sometimes multiple bodies deep, and occasionally rain would wash things back to the surface, which is less than ideal for property values. So the government did what governments do best. They overreacted and passed a bunch of new laws. The Burial Acts of the 1850s created new garden cemeteries on the city's edge. Highgate, Kensal Green, Brompton. Beautiful places, actually. Full of angels and weeping willows and entirely too many dead Victorians. But this also meant that death was being outsourced. No longer something that happened in the front parlor, but something that got shipped off to professionals in black coats and top hats. The undertaker, once a rare sight, became a regular feature. He had business cards, catalogs, and a knack for upselling coffins with unnecessary levels of mahogany. And with this shift, the humble layer-out began to lose her footing. Before long, undertakers offered complete funeral packages. They handled the washing, dressing, and presentation of the body, services that women had done quietly for centuries. And of course, being men, they charged more and got more respect for it. You can find advertisements in Victorian newspapers boasting modern sanitary preparation of the deceased. Translation: we do what that old widow down the street used to do, but now it comes with paperwork. It's not that the layers out disappeared overnight. They held on in poorer districts well into the 1880s and 90s, but their reputation started to change. What was once seen as an act of charity became something unclean, almost improper. Respectable women weren't supposed to handle the dead anymore, not when men in suits could do it with scientific precision. There's a dark irony here. The medicalization of death, which was meant to make things safer, cleaner, more rational, actually erased a space where women had held quiet authority. For centuries, they had managed both ends of life. They delivered babies, tended the sick, and laid out the dead. They were midwives in every sense of the word, between life and afterlife. Then the men arrived with stethoscopes and clipboards, and suddenly the same knowledge was unhygienic or unqualified. By the early 1900s, professional nurses and mortuary attendants had replaced the old neighborhood women almost completely. The domestic wisdom of generations, gone or written off as superstition. Of course, that's progress for you. One moment you're indispensable, the next you're an anecdote in someone's dusty history podcast. And yet, if you listen closely to the way we still talk about death, the euphemisms, the gentle rituals, you can hear echoes of their work. We still use soft lighting at funerals. We still comb the hair, smooth the clothes, and whisper words meant to make death seem less final. We still perform a kind of emotional tidying up. It's just that now, it happens behind closed doors, with professionals who wear latex gloves instead of shawls. There were, however, moments when the old ways clashed with the new world in rather awkward fashion. In one 1883 report from a London coroner's office, a family had prepared the body before the doctor arrived, which turned out to be a problem because the doctor was supposed to determine how the person died. But the layer-out, being thorough, had already washed away the evidence. Her defense? He looked dirty, and honestly, fair enough. Another story, less funny, more tragic, involved a cholera victim in 1849. The layer-out was called in before the authorities had officially declared the house quarantined. She did her job, collected her few coins, and left, only to fall ill and die herself 3 days later. The death notice described her simply as a woman of no known profession, which is bleakly poetic, considering she had one. We also shouldn't forget how these women were viewed socially. They lived in a strange limbo, part nurse, part pariah. Neighbors might nod politely in the street, but few invited them to tea. There was always the lingering superstition that someone who worked with the dead carried some of that death with them. It's the same reason people avoided gravediggers or executioners. Necessary trades, but not exactly dinner party material. One Victorian writer described them as those sad creatures who stand too near the veil. A bit dramatic, maybe, but not entirely wrong. Many lived alone. Many drank, and many, when they died, had no one left to lay them out in turn. Let's drift for a moment to the late 1890s, a world of flickering gaslight and early electricity. The old London fog is starting to thin, replaced by industrial smoke. The city hums louder now. Telegraphs, trains, factories. And somewhere in the maze of narrow streets, there's still one old woman with her basin and her bag. She's been doing this for 30 years. She's seen cholera, typhus, the worst of the workhouses. She's buried babies, soldiers, prostitutes, old men who froze to death in alleys. Tonight she's called to a tenement. A young mother has died giving birth. The husband is silent, the baby cries in another room. She does her work the way she always has, quietly, efficiently, almost tenderly. When she finishes, she folds the shroud, adjusts the hands, and whispers, "There now, all tidy." It's not poetry, it's habit. But in that moment, she restores a little dignity to a life that had very little of it. And that's the thing about these forgotten professions. They rarely leave monuments. There's no monument to the layers out of London standing in Hyde Park. Just a few lines in parish ledgers, a few old coins exchanged in gratitude, and the faint scent of soap and candle smoke lost to time. But they remind us that history isn't just battles and kings and marble statues. It's also the quiet work done by people who didn't get to write their own stories. The small acts of order in a world that never stopped falling apart. So as you drift towards sleep, imagine those women one last time, moving softly through rooms lit by candlelight, washing the dead with hands that trembled from exhaustion but never from fear, folding the sheets, closing the eyes, whispering little nothings to the silence. No medals, no titles, just a job done with grim, practical grace. And when they disappeared from the record, the world barely noticed. But maybe, tonight we do. Hey again, night owl. Still awake? Don't worry, we're not doing anything too scary tonight. Just some light 19th century necromancy. If the Victorians taught us anything, it's that grief doesn't end when the funeral does. You bury the body, but the longing, that just finds new hobbies. And for many Victorians, that hobby was talking to ghosts. Now, before we roll our eyes, it's worth remembering, this was an era obsessed with progress. Electricity was lighting up homes, trains were outrunning horses, and telegrams were crossing oceans. It felt like science could do anything. So why not communication with the dead? If you could send a message to India in 5 minutes, surely you could send one to heaven, right? That's how spiritualism was born. A mix of grief, science envy, and a pinch of melodrama. It started, as so many things do, with teenage girls in a dark room. In 1848, in a little house in Hydesville, New York, two sisters, Maggie and Kate Fox, began hearing mysterious knocking sounds in the night. They claimed the raps were messages from a ghost. Apparently, the spirit of a murdered peddler was trying to chat from under the floorboards. Instead of calling pest control, the girls decided to invent a code. 1 knock for yes, 2 for no. Before long, neighbors were lining up to ask questions. The Fox sisters went viral before viral existed. And soon, seance tables were popping up everywhere. From New York drawing rooms to London parlors. By the 1850s, spiritualism had crossed the Atlantic, and the British elite were hosting ghost parties like it was the latest Parisian fad. Now, no one embraced a fad quite like the Victorians. They already loved ceremony, candlelight, and melodrama, at a table that moves mysteriously on its own, and they were in. Parlors became portals. Ladies in lace whispered to invisible hands. Gentlemen took notes, pretending not to be terrified. It was the perfect social event. No alcohol, no dancing, but plenty of trembling and gossip afterward. And here's where our story loops back to Queen Victoria again. Because of course it does. This woman didn't just inspire the mourning industry, she also turned seances into royal entertainment. After Prince Albert's death, Victoria was desperate for any contact, any sign that her beloved husband still existed somewhere, somehow. Enter a young Scottish medium named John Brown, her servant, rumored confidant, and possibly the most patient man in British history. Victoria trusted him completely. He arranged seances for her, introduced her to spirit photographers, and even helped her interpret dreams as messages from Albert. She called them her little comforts, which is both sweet and slightly unsettling. One of her favorite mediums was Robert James Lees, who claimed to channel Albert directly. He would sit, close his eyes, and write down messages supposedly dictated from the beyond. Victoria was convinced it was real. Albert, she said, had spoken to her through Lees, tender words of reassurance in fluent German. Skeptics pointed out that Lees was also fluent in German. But details. For Victoria, it wasn't about proof. It was about presence. After all, when you've built an empire on the idea of continuity, of duty beyond death, it's comforting to think your husband just moved to another office. Outside the palace, the craze spread fast. Seances became so popular that newspapers started publishing etiquette tips for them. You couldn't just summon your late aunt between dessert courses, apparently. There was protocol. Don't ask too many questions at once. Don't invite skeptics, their energy ruins the vibe. And absolutely no laughing unless the table starts it first. Yes, tables. Because by this point, table turning had become a national pastime. Participants would sit around a small table, place their hands lightly on it, and wait. Eventually, it would begin to tremble, rock, or even spin, allegedly powered by spirits. In reality, it was probably powered by subconscious muscle movement, a phenomenon later named the idiomotor effect. But the Victorians didn't care. They just wanted proof that their dead still cared enough to flip furniture. Then came spirit photography, perhaps the most delightfully creepy innovation of the era. The idea was simple. You'd sit for a portrait, and a faint image of your deceased loved one would mysteriously appear beside you on the developed photo. Early practitioners like William Mumler made small fortunes producing these ghostly double exposures. His most famous client? None other than Mary Todd Lincoln, who posed with the transparent outline of her assassinated husband, Abraham Lincoln, resting a hand on her shoulder. Across the Atlantic, London photographers like Frederick Hudson offered similar services, promising a photographic likeness of those departed through the mercy of heaven. It sounds solemn, but it was mostly sleight of hand, darkroom manipulation, and wishful thinking. Still, for grieving Victorians, it was irresistible. You could literally see your loved one again, even if they were suspiciously blurry and wearing a bedsheet. By the 1870s, spiritualism was practically mainstream. Even scientists got involved, or at least tried to debunk it politely. Physicist Michael Faraday conducted experiments to prove that table turning was caused by unconscious pressure, not ghosts. He was right, of course, but no one likes a buzzkill. Meanwhile, poet Alfred Lord Tennyson dabbled in seances for poetic inspiration. And Arthur Conan Doyle, yes, the creator of Sherlock Holmes, became one of spiritualism's most passionate defenders. Ironically, the man who wrote fiction's most rational detective spent his real life arguing with skeptics about fairies and ectoplasm. History, as always, has a sense of humor. Now, not everyone in Victorian London could afford a fancy seance with crystal balls and velvet drapes. But they improvised. In poorer districts, penny seances were held in back rooms and basements. A local medium, often a woman, would dim the lamps, light a candle, and claim to summon spirits for a small fee. For many working-class families who'd lost children to disease, it was the only affordable therapy they'd ever get. So, while the upper classes treated ghosts like dinner entertainment, the poor treated them like hope. Different motives, same yearning. And yet, the line between sincerity and scam was thin. Professional mediums quickly learned how to deliver what audiences wanted. Floating trumpets, mysterious lights, even ghostly hands that reached out of the dark. One particularly famous case was Florence Cook, a teenage medium who claimed to materialize a spirit named Katie King. During seances, Katie would appear, a pale, veiled woman who floated gracefully around the room, speaking softly. The twist? She looked suspiciously like Florence in a white bedsheet. At one seance, a skeptical guest literally grabbed the ghost and discovered it was indeed just Florence in costume. The scandal didn't end her career, though. If anything, it made her more famous. Because as any modern influencer knows, controversy boosts engagement. Eventually, The Victorians' love affair with ghosts started to fade. By the 1890s, the novelty had worn off, and scientific skepticism was catching up. The Society for Psychical Research, founded in 1882, began systematically investigating mediums. They found, let's say, mixed results. Some mediums were exposed as frauds. Others produced genuinely strange phenomena that couldn't be easily explained. But the deeper truth was that the seances themselves weren't really about science or proof. They were about comfort, about softening the edges of loss. And in that sense, the Victorians weren't all that different from us. We just use different rituals now. Memorial posts, old voicemails, AI chatbots that imitate dead loved ones. The tools change, but the ache stays the same. Let's drift back for a moment into that candlelit London parlor. A group of people sit around a table. The air is thick with smoke and nervous laughter. A woman in black lace closes her eyes. Her hands tremble. She whispers, "Is there anyone here who wishes to speak?" The table creaks once. Someone gasps. Maybe it's just the wood expanding in the damp air. Maybe it's something else. Either way, the room falls still, suspended between disbelief and desperate hope. That, right there, is the essence of Victorian spiritualism. Not the tricks or the raps, but the pause. The space where silence feels almost alive. By the end of the century, spiritualism had transformed from fringe curiosity to social institution, then back to fringe again. But its influence lingered. The language of seances, messages from beyond, crossing over, energy in the room, still echoes in modern spirituality. And the Victorians, for all their superstition, forced science to confront questions it preferred to ignore. What is consciousness? Where does it go? And why do we keep trying to reach across that line again and again? For people who lived surrounded by death, epidemics, accidents, and high infant mortality, the desire to believe in continuity wasn't silly. It was survival. So what happened to those women, the mediums, the mourners, the caretakers of the dead? They became, in their own quiet way, the emotional backbone of an empire terrified of its own progress. They soothed the dying, comforted the living, and, when the living got lonely, pretended to deliver messages from the other side. They were grief's entrepreneurs. And like all entrepreneurs, they gave the people exactly what they wanted. Let's end tonight's wandering where it began, in the hush of a Victorian bedroom. The curtains drawn, the city quiet outside. A widow sits by a flickering lamp, a photograph of her husband on the nightstand. She whispers his name, half believing he might whisper back. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolls 12. Tomorrow, she'll go on. She'll wear her black dress, write polite thank you notes, maybe even attend a seance with her sister. But tonight, for a few still minutes, she allows herself to believe. And really, who can blame her? The Victorians turned mourning into ritual, ritual into performance, and performance into faith. They dressed their grief in black silk, photographed their ghosts, and built entire industries out of longing. And though we've traded creep for comfort food and seances for scrolling, we're still haunted in the same way, by love that doesn't know where to go. So if your eyes are heavy now and the room feels a little quieter than before, don't worry. That's just history settling in. Sleep well among the echoes. Hey there, night owls. Welcome back to the quiet corner of history where everyone either gets executed or exiled, and somehow their kids end up paying for it. Tonight's story is about those unlucky souls, the children of royal traitors. You know, the ones who didn't ask to be born into a family that decided to go toe-to-toe with the crown and lost. So, dim the lights, pull up your blankets, maybe sip something warm, because tonight we're gliding through the softly tragic lives of princes and princesses who inherited not jewels, but shame. And honestly, it's a lot of paperwork, exile, and people dying in damp castles. But that's kind of perfect bedtime material, isn't it? Let's start with the Plantagenets, because nothing says royal dysfunction like the medieval English crown. You might remember Richard II, the moody teenage king who believed he was divinely appointed, allergic to criticism, and somehow shocked when his cousin Henry Bolingbroke decided to overthrow him. Richard, of course, was deposed in 1399, starved to death, or maybe accidentally starved, records differ. And that was that. But what about the kids connected to him? Well, that's where the mess begins. Richard himself didn't have children, but plenty of his relatives did. And after Henry Bolingbroke became Henry IV, everyone even vaguely descended from Edward III suddenly looked suspicious. If your family tree had one too many royal branches, congratulations, you were officially, potentially treasonous. So many of those children, innocent minor nobles, were quietly shuffled into monasteries, for their own safety, which in medieval royal terms basically meant you'll spend the rest of your life praying for the soul of the man who executed your uncle. Sleep tight, little Plantagenet. Then there's the Grey family, poster children for how not to manage ambition. Their story revolves around Lady Jane Grey, the so-called 9 Days Queen. A poor teenage girl who was smarter than everyone around her, but also unfortunate enough to be a pawn in her parents' power game. Jane's father, Henry Grey, Duke of Suffolk, decided to play "Let's put my daughter on the throne" when Edward VI died. It didn't go well. Mary Tudor, soon to be Bloody Mary, marched in with an army, and within weeks, Jane, her husband, and her parents were all under arrest. Now, Henry Grey's children, Jane, Catherine, and Mary Grey, were all swept into that mess. Jane, of course, was executed in 1554 at age 16. Catherine and Mary were spared, mostly because Mary Tudor had the energy for only so many beheadings before breakfast. But spared is doing a lot of work there. Catherine was imprisoned for marrying without royal permission, her big crime being that she married for love. And Mary Grey, the youngest sister, who was so tiny and physically frail that courtiers described her as dwarfish, was also locked away for marrying a commoner. So the daughters of a traitor lived out their years in comfortable yet suffocating captivity, barred from court, barred from love, and barred from any hope of escape. It's the Tudor version of being grounded forever. Let's float over to Scotland, because the Scots never did anything by halves. Meet James Douglas, Earl of Morton, Regent of Scotland for the young James VI, later James I of England. Morton was executed in 1581 for what else? Treason. His head was displayed on a spike, which in Scotland was basically the equivalent of a bad Yelp review. Now, the Douglas family was enormous, and when one of them fell, the rest had to scramble to prove they weren't that kind of Douglas. Children were stripped of titles, lands confiscated, and some were quietly married off to unthreatening minor nobles in the Highlands, far from Edinburgh and any whiff of rebellion. It was the royal version of, "We're moving to another town for a fresh start." But Scotland also gave us one of the most pitiful cases. Mary, Queen of Scots' son, little James VI himself. Technically, he wasn't the child of a traitor. He was the child of a convicted traitor. When Mary was forced to abdicate in 1567, She left her 1-year-old son behind. He grew up surrounded by men who had imprisoned his mother, all while being told she was too dangerous to see. It's not hard to imagine the trust issues that gave him. When he later became King of England and Scotland, James liked to be surrounded by pretty young men who flattered him and never disagreed. And maybe, just maybe, that had something to do with being raised in a world where affection was conditional and everyone smiled while plotting. So yes, sometimes the child of a traitor becomes king. But even then, they don't really get a happy ending. Next up, France, where treason was practically a family sport. Let's talk about François de Montmorency, a noble who managed to annoy both the king and the pope, which is quite an achievement. After being accused of conspiring against the crown during the French Wars of Religion, he was executed, his lands confiscated, and his relatives scattered like breadcrumbs. His children were raised under heavy surveillance, their education supervised by royal appointees, and their marriages carefully arranged to ensure they wouldn't produce more rebellious Montmorencys. And you know what's worse than growing up in luxury under watch? Having everyone in court treat you like you might explode at any moment. One of Francois's grandsons later became a cardinal, mostly because the safest place for a suspicious noble in France was the church. The irony of being forced into holiness as punishment for someone else's sin. Well, it's peak 16th century logic. Now for a brief detour through Spain, land of golden crowns and constant paranoia. We can't skip Don Carlos, the infamous son of Philip II of Spain. Technically, Carlos wasn't the child of a traitor. He was the accused traitor himself. But his story gives us a glimpse of how kings handled family problems. Carlos was erratic, unstable, and possibly mentally ill. A side effect of generations of royal inbreeding so intense it could have been its own sport. When he started plotting against his father, or at least saying he was plotting, no one's really sure, Philip had him locked away for his own good. Carlos died in solitary confinement, likely starved or poisoned, though the official line was natural causes, because of course it was. After his death, anyone even slightly related to him had to publicly prove their loyalty to Philip. That meant endless processions, loyalty oaths, and wearing very somber black for a man they barely knew. Royal grief, the performative kind. England again. Because when it comes to executing nobles and ruining their families, the English always over-deliver. Thomas More, the saintly scholar who stood up to Henry VIII, was executed for refusing to recognize the king as head of the church. And while More was canonized centuries later, his children had to live through the very unsaintly aftermath. His daughter, Margaret Roper, adored her father. She famously smuggled his head off London Bridge after his execution, because love means never letting go, apparently. The rest of the family was left penniless for a while, dependent on sympathetic friends. It's kind of touching, in a morbid way. The man who wrote Utopia left his actual family in dystopian misery. We'll glide next to the 17th century, when rebellion was basically trending. During the English Civil War, families were torn apart. If your dad picked the wrong side, royalist or parliamentarian, you could lose everything overnight. Take the children of Charles I, executed in 1649. Technically, they weren't the children of a traitor, but Parliament did brand him one before chopping off his head. So, in legal terms, yes, they were orphans of treason. The eldest, Charles II, spent years in exile, hopping between European courts, borrowing money, and writing letters begging for help to reclaim the throne. It's less glamorous than it sounds. His siblings, Mary, James, and little Henry, were shuffled around Europe like political pawns. Princess Mary married the Prince of Orange, which was nice until smallpox got her, and James eventually became James VI, one of Britain's least popular kings, who got kicked out in the Glorious Revolution. So the legacy of their father's beheading lived on. 2 generations of exiles, overthrows, and polite continental embarrassment. Let's drift over to Russia, because no one does family betrayal quite like the Romanovs. Meet Alexei Petrovich, the unfortunate son of Peter the Great. Peter wanted his son to be a modern, Western-minded ruler. Alexei wanted not that. He preferred reading and religion to warfare and modernization. Peter accused him of plotting to overthrow him. Alexei was imprisoned, tortured, and died in custody, probably beaten to death by order of his own father. And here's the royal twist. Peter then made sure everyone knew that he, the Tsar, was still the victim in all this. He forced courtiers to sign a declaration agreeing that Alexei had been a traitor. So the children of traitors in Russia, they didn't stand a chance. Even if they were the Tsar's grandchildren, they were watched, mistrusted, and erased from official portraits. Royal forgiveness was not exactly a family value. Over in France again, things got dramatically bureaucratic under Louis XIV, the original I am the state guy. If your relative annoyed the king, you didn't just lose your head, you lost your future. Children of executed nobles were quietly placed in convents, often under fake names. Some grew up not even knowing who their parents were until adulthood. One case stands out. Louis de Rohan, whose father was implicated in a conspiracy against the crown. He spent most of his youth under house arrest, officially for his education. That's a very fancy way of saying you're going nowhere. And of course, we can't skip the French Revolution, where everyone became a traitor eventually. The children of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette are probably the most tragic royal offspring in history. Their daughter, Marie-Thérèse, survived, but only barely. She was imprisoned for years, alone in a dark cell, while her parents and little brother were executed. Her brother, Louis Charles, was kept in solitary confinement. He died around age 10, officially from illness, but given the conditions, it's a miracle he lasted that long. Marie-Thérèse was released after the revolution and lived the rest of her life in quiet exile, never speaking of what happened. Imagine being the only surviving member of a royal family everyone now hated. Sleepy history doesn't get sadder than that. And here's the quiet irony that ties all of this together. Royal traitors weren't really traitors most of the time. They were victims of power shifts, bad timing, or just being related to the wrong cousin. Their children carried the weight of those politics, sometimes for generations. Their names erased, their portraits hidden, their family crests quietly chiseled off palace walls. The price of rebellion, it seems, wasn't death. It was survival under watch. If you're still awake, impressive. You've survived through royal betrayals, imprisonments, and some light emotional trauma, courtesy of Europe's most dysfunctional families. Tonight, we're floating deeper into that quiet, foggy aftermath, the world of exiled and forgotten children. The ones sent away from court, erased from portraits, and politely never mentioned again at dinner. They didn't die dramatically. They just disappeared into foreign estates, damp convents, and drafty castles, living out decades in soft disgrace. Let's begin with a particularly awkward case. The children of James VI of England, because nothing says awkward like being royal in a country that's decided it's done with your entire bloodline. After the glorious revolution of 1688, which was not that glorious if you were on the losing side, James II fled to France, leaving behind chaos and a newborn son. James Francis Edward Stuart, later known as the Old Pretender. It's a bit sad when your nickname literally means the guy who pretends he's king. The poor child grew up in exile at the Château de Saint-Germain-en-Laye under the protection of Louis XIV. He was raised to believe he was still the rightful king of England, Scotland, and Ireland, though to everyone else, he was just that awkward house guest who wouldn't leave. His supporters, the Jacobites, kept plotting uprisings to restore him. Spoiler, they all failed. And when James eventually had his own sons, they became the Young Pretender, aka Bonnie Prince Charlie, and his brother, Henry Benedict, who just became a cardinal because at some point you have to admit defeat and take holy orders. So, 3 generations of men who spent their entire lives pretending to be kings. A full dynasty of royal imposters, living on French pensions, clinging to ceremonial titles like King over the Water. It's the historical equivalent of never getting over your high school glory days. Let's gently drift east now to Poland, because exiled children there had a flair for melodrama and melancholy. When Stanisław Leszczyński was deposed as King of Poland for the second time, he really should have stopped at 1. His daughter Maria Leszczyńska found herself in a strange position. She was both a royal exile and future Queen of France. Louis XV married her mostly because she was politically harmless. She had no armies, no lands, and no ambitions, which for Louis was ideal. He already had mistresses for excitement. Maria spent her entire life being politely ignored at Versailles, quietly painting, praying, and pretending not to notice her husband's affairs. And yet, she outlived almost everyone in that glittering, scandal-ridden court. Proof that sometimes the best revenge for exile is endurance. Now over to Spain again, where royal betrayal was basically seasonal. Meet Juan de la Cerda, Duke of Medinaceli. His family had once been close to the crown, but when an ancestor got tangled in a conspiracy, every Medinaceli child was carefully monitored by the Spanish Inquisition. Imagine growing up under the eyes of men who believed curiosity was a sin. Children of suspect houses were raised to overcompensate. They became the most obedient courtiers, the most pious priests, the most loyal soldiers, anything to bleach out that family stain. And it worked, sort of. The Medinacelists clawed their way back to favor by sheer performance. By the 18th century, they were back at court, nodding politely beside kings who'd once branded their ancestors as traitors. So technically, exile could be reversible. If you had enough patience, humility, and maybe a few convenient marriages. Let's glide north for a moment to Sweden, land of snow, melancholy, and monarchs who were one bad winter away from treason. In the early 19th century, Gustav IV Adolf was overthrown after a disastrous war against Russia. His crime was losing Finland, basically half the kingdom. His son, Prince Gustav, was exiled at age 10. He spent the rest of his life drifting between German courts, a royal child without a country. He called himself the Count of Itterberg, which sounds like a made-up title for a man slowly realizing no one's inviting him to dinner anymore. What's oddly poetic is that Gustav's descendants eventually married into other European royal families, including somehow back into the Swedish line generations later. Royal blood, like mold, always finds its way back. Meanwhile, In Italy, there's the haunting story of Carlo di Borbon's descendants. Carlo's family got tangled in the Napoleonic Wars. Wrong alliances, bad timing, you know the drill. His son, Francesco, spent his childhood on the run, sleeping in borrowed palaces, being told not to mention his surname too loudly. By the time he reached adulthood, the family estates were gone, their titles in dispute, and their claim to anything more than nostalgia non-existent. But the Bourbon children grew up surrounded by portraits of ancestors in gilded armor. They were taught that one day, the rightful throne would be restored. It never was. It's amazing how often European children went to bed dreaming not of toys or sweets, but of imaginary crowns. Let's move to France again, but this time to the Revolution's quieter aftermath. The Bourbon Restoration. Remember Marie-Thérèse, the surviving daughter of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette? She's back. After years in imprisonment, she was finally released and lived in exile in Vienna and later in England. When Napoleon fell, she returned to France, to a country that simultaneously pitied and resented her. She walked through streets where people whispered her parents' names like bad omens. At court, she was treated like a living ghost, respected, but never quite alive. She never had children, perhaps wisely deciding that the Bourbon line had suffered enough. When she died in 1851, she was buried with honors, but the world had already moved on. France had cycled through empires, kings, and republics like fashion trends. She was the last living link to a monarchy everyone preferred to forget. Now, let's quietly wander across to Germany, where royal kids had a whole other problem. There were too many of them. Hundreds of tiny duchies, each with their own noble houses, their own petty rivalries, and their own opportunities for treason. Take the House of Brunswick. When one branch supported Napoleon and another opposed him, the family basically imploded. Those on the losing side were stripped of their titles and lands. Their children, little princes and princesses, were sent into quiet exile in Austria and Prussia. They lived off small stipends, writing increasingly desperate letters to cousins who no longer replied. It's astonishing how quickly royal correspondence dries up when your father's been hanged for treason. And then there's Napoleon's own family. Because when you overthrow half of Europe, someone's bound to call you a traitor. After his fall, the Bonaparte children were scattered like chess pieces. His son, Napoleon II, known as the Eaglet, was taken to Austria and raised by his mother's family, the Habsburgs. They didn't let him call himself Napoleon. They didn't even let him speak French at first. He grew up sickly, lonely, and very aware that every adult around him was terrified he might someday try to reclaim his father's empire. He died at 21 from tuberculosis, though, knowing Habsburg genetics, that was probably the least surprising part of his life. His Austrian relatives had turned him into a polite, fragile museum piece, the heir to an empire who wasn't even allowed to own a sword. Let's float gently into the 19th century, the age of polite banishment. Being the child of a royal traitor was no longer a death sentence, but more of a social downgrade. Instead of execution, you got extended travel. Instead of imprisonment, private education abroad. For example, the children of Prince Lucien Bonaparte, Napoleon's rebellious brother, grew up in England, technically guests, but never quite welcome. They were invited to parties, but seated very far from the head of the table. They published poetry no one read, painted landscapes no one bought, and wrote long letters about the glorious family name, while applying for small pensions from the British government. Royal exile had become boring, which is probably progress. Over in Russia, though, things stayed predictably bleak. After the Decembrist revolt in 1825, that early attempt by noble officers to reform the empire, the Tsar didn't just punish the men involved. He went after their families. Wives who followed their husbands into Siberian exile were forbidden to bring their children. Those children were often raised by the state, stripped of noble titles, and never allowed to mention their parents again. Some of them later reunited with their mothers decades later, only to realize they no longer shared a language, a culture, or even a sense of self. It's the kind of heartbreak that doesn't make for a good bedtime story, but we're already here, so let's just quietly acknowledge it and keep floating. Meanwhile, in Britain's later history, treason got subtler, more social than violent. After the Jacobite cause finally fizzled out, the descendants of rebels slowly reintegrated into polite society. By the 19th century, you could find Jacobite heirs serving tea at English country estates, married to people who pretended they'd never heard of Culloden. Their family portraits still hung in attics. Not destroyed, just inconvenient. Because nothing ruins a dinner party like a great-grandfather in a tartan sash labeled Enemy of the Crown. And perhaps the quietest tragedy of all. The children who were too young to even understand what their parents had done. They grew up hearing two stories. The official one, where their family were villains, and the private one, whispered by old servants, where their parents were heroes. Imagine trying to build an identity between those versions. History doesn't record their names much. They don't get portraits or palaces or operas. But they're the thread running through all these tales, the silent generation that carried guilt without ever earning it. It's almost comforting in a strange way. No matter how high the family climbed, no matter how gilded the palace, the fall always echoed the same. Banishment, obscurity, silence. The exiled and the forgotten became Europe's quiet foundation, living proof that royal power was never permanent and bloodlines were just names on paper. Their lives remind us that history isn't just made by those who ruled, it's also made by those who were erased. So, as the night deepens and the centuries blur together, let's end on a whisper of perspective. For every glittering monarch who stood on a balcony, waving to adoring crowds, there was some small child locked away in a distant manor, punished for a crown they never wore. And that, in a way, might be the most royal fate of all. Welcome back, sleepless historians. If you've made it this far, congratulations. You're officially more patient than most royal bloodlines. Tonight, we're gliding into the melancholy twilight of those who came back. The forgotten heirs who dared to return. Years, decades, sometimes generations after their families had fallen. They were ghosts walking back into history, trying to pick up crowns long since melted down and sold. And while their stories aren't exactly heroic, they're quietly fascinating. So, settle in, let the past breathe a little, and let's see what happens when exile meets nostalgia. We'll begin where all good comeback stories begin. France, naturally, because the French monarchy didn't just fall once. It fell spectacularly and then kept trying to resurrect itself like a very determined zombie. After the Revolution and Napoleon's brief fireworks show, the Bourbons made their grand return in 1814. The surviving royals, led by Louis XVIII, brother of the executed Louis XVI, arrived in Paris pretending everything was normal. It wasn't. Half the country still worshipped Napoleon. The other half had learned to live without kings, And here came the Bourbons in powdered wigs, acting like they'd just been on vacation. Louis XVIII tried to govern calmly, but his return was haunted by ghosts, literal and political. People whispered about the missing royal children, especially the lost Dauphin, Louis Charles, who died in prison. Dozens of impostors claimed to be him, popping up across Europe like historical mushrooms. One man in Germany even convinced a few nobles he was the real prince. For a time he received visitors, gave royal blessings, and wore an expression that said, "Yes, I survived the guillotine. Thank you for asking." France, to its credit, mostly rolled its eyes. Still, the emotional damage lingered. Every Bourbon who returned carried that unspoken guilt, the weight of a dynasty that couldn't die properly. And perhaps the saddest part, most of them didn't even want the throne back by then. They just wanted home. Let's drift over to Scotland, where royal nostalgia always wore tartan. After the Jacobite rebellions failed, exiled Stuarts kept trying to come back, in spirit, if not in person. The most famous, of course, was Charles Edward Stuart, better known as Bonnie Prince Charlie. He'd grown up in Italy, raised on stories of how his family had been cheated of the British throne. In 1745, he finally made his move, sailing to Scotland with a handful of men and an absurd amount of optimism. For a brief, glittering moment, it almost worked. The clans rallied, Edinburgh fell, and Charles held court like he was born to it. But then came Culloden, and with it, the end of the dream. When Charles fled back to France, hiding in the Highlands dressed as a servant, the legend of the Lost Prince was born. But the man himself, the real Charles, spent his later years drinking, sulking, and shouting at servants in Rome. He was the ultimate failed returner, romantic in myth, depressing in reality. His daughter, Charlotte Stuart, tried to restore the family's dignity by serving as his caretaker and, ironically, by being more competent than any man in the line. She didn't succeed politically, but she managed something rarer: peace. The Stuart line ended with a sigh, not a sword. Now gently to Spain, where every royal comeback seemed to involve an entire civil war. When Ferdinand II was forced to abdicate by Napoleon, his daughter Isabella II eventually reclaimed the throne, technically making her a returning heir. But her reign was a mess of coups, conspiracies, and chaos. It turns out that when you inherit power from a family famous for backstabbing, your allies tend to have sharp objects too. Isabella was deposed and exiled in 1868, then quietly allowed to return years later, not as a queen, but as a tired woman who'd learned that palaces have too many mirrors. She spent her final years in Paris, occasionally visiting Spain like a relative who doesn't know when to leave the reunion. The Bourbon line, though, never gives up. Her son, Alfonso XII, restored the monarchy again, only for it to crumble yet again a generation later. The Spanish royal family is like history's most determined boomerang. No matter how far you throw it, it just keeps coming back, slightly more dented each time. Let's float north again to Denmark, where the returns were gentler, almost polite. In the 14th century, King Valdemar IV had seized power by ousting a rival noble family known as the Abels. Their children were exiled to Germany, stripped of lands, and politely told to reflect on their disloyalty. A few decades later, one of their descendants quietly returned, married into the royal line, and reintroduced the Abels into Danish nobility. No battles, no drama, no angry mobs, just time and paperwork. Sometimes, history's comebacks are less about swords and more about persistence. The moral seems to be, If you can wait a few generations, everyone forgets you're a traitor. Speaking of slow revenge, let's visit Austria, land of operas and repressed political grudges. After the execution of Archduke Maximilian in Mexico, his widow Carlota lost her mind from grief, and their would-be heirs faded into obscurity. But the Habsburgs, being Habsburgs, always had cousins in reserve. The children of Maximilian's brother, Archduke Karl Ludwig, would later include Franz Ferdinand. Yes, that Franz Ferdinand, the man whose assassination started World War I. In a grimly poetic way, Franz Ferdinand's attempt to restore the Habsburg name's prestige, to modernize the empire and ensure his children inherited something more stable, ended with the dynasty collapsing entirely. So technically, he was a returner, just one whose comeback blew up everything. Now, let's ease our way into Russia again, because no family tried harder to come back than the Romanovs. After the revolution, surviving relatives fled in every direction: Paris, London, New York. They worked as chauffeurs, waiters, even dance instructors. Then, in the 1920s, imposters began to appear. The most famous was Anna Anderson, who claimed to be Grand Duchess Anastasia, daughter of the executed Tsar Nicholas II. Her story captivated the world. She looked a bit like Anastasia. She knew certain details. People wanted to believe her, because the real truth, a family gunned down in a basement, was too grim to accept. For decades, the myth of Anastasia lingered like perfume in a closed room. But when DNA testing finally arrived in the late 20th century, it confirmed what many already suspected. Anna wasn't a Romanov. Just another lost soul trying to come home to a family that no longer existed. And maybe that's the perfect metaphor for all royal returners, chasing ghosts of thrones that had already turned to dust. Still, a few did manage it. For instance, Charles II of England, who we left earlier drinking in exile. After years of failed plots and endless begging letters, he finally reclaimed his throne in 1660. London welcomed him back like a celebrity returning from scandal rehab. But the restoration wasn't a fairy tale. Charles came home older, cynical, and surrounded by people who'd once toasted his father's death. He ruled with a kind of weary humor, famously saying he'd never said a wise thing and never done a foolish one, which is either self-awareness or exhaustion. And while he died childless, officially at least, unofficially, the man had enough illegitimate offspring to populate a small town. He did restore the monarchy's dignity. For about 5 minutes, anyway. Over in Portugal, the royal returns came with ships, storms, and an ocean's worth of drama. In 1807, the Portuguese royal family fled to Brazil when Napoleon invaded. They ruled from Rio de Janeiro for over a decade, sipping tropical fruit juice while Europe burned. When they finally returned home, they were foreigners in their own country, out of touch, overdressed, and sunburned. The heir, Pedro I, refused to return entirely. He liked Brazil so much that he declared it an independent empire and made himself emperor. So technically, he came back, but in the opposite direction, and his descendants still rule Brazil's nostalgia. Let's drift back toward Italy, where royal exile and return were practically a routine. After the unification of Italy in the 19th century, dozens of minor princes were pushed aside. Some, like the Bourbons of the Two Sicilies, spent decades in France and Austria waiting for the restoration. It never came, but their descendants still show up at weddings of European royals, wearing medals from kingdoms that no longer exist. It's a very specific kind of delusion, ceremonial importance without actual relevance. Still, They keep the candles lit, the titles polished, and the family trees aggressively updated. Because for some people, the idea of return is enough. And maybe that's the heart of it all. For most of these exiled heirs, coming back wasn't about power, it was about identity. About trying to exist in a world that had moved on without them. The ones who succeeded often found that home wasn't what they remembered. The ones who failed, well, at least they had the comfort of trying. Because the saddest truth in royal history is that it's easier to lose a throne than to find a purpose afterward. Let's close tonight with one last image. The quietest of all returns. In the early 20th century, long after the age of crowns had faded, descendants of the Stuarts, Bourbons, and Habsburgs began visiting their ancestral castles, now museums and tourist attractions. They'd walk through halls where their ancestors had plotted, dined, and prayed. No guards, no courtiers, just curious visitors with cameras. Sometimes they'd leave flowers. Sometimes they'd just stand there, silent, in rooms that had forgotten their names. And in that silence you realize, history always comes back. Just not always in the form it expects. So, if your eyelids are heavy and your tea's gone cold, take this last thought with you. Every royal child of a traitor, every exile, every forgotten heir, they all walked the same path. Away from power, toward peace. And maybe that's the real inheritance they passed down. Elizabeth was crowned queen in 1558, and despite being the daughter of a so-called traitor queen, she managed to do something her parents couldn't: stay alive and on the throne. She ruled for 45 years. She never married. Perhaps she had seen enough of how marriage worked out for her mother, and she turned herself into something else entirely. An icon, a living legend. The Virgin Queen. It's almost poetic, really. Anne Boleyn died for her ambition. Elizabeth made hers eternal. But here's the strange, melancholy symmetry. Elizabeth had no children. The daughter of the woman who changed England's religious destiny left no heirs. The dynasty her father had torn the world apart to build simply ran out. By the time Elizabeth died in 1603, the Tudors were extinct. A whole line of passionate, dangerous, and deeply flawed monarchs burned through the century like a bright candle, and then fizzled out. It's easy to forget how many Tudor children never made it. Henry VIII had 3 legitimate heirs, Edward, Mary, and Elizabeth, but he also had stillborn sons, miscarried daughters, and who knows how many illegitimate children scattered through the countryside. Some of those boys grew up quietly, never acknowledged, maybe bearing the king's jawline and temper, but none of his crown. Some historians think that's the real curse of royal blood. When your only legacy is genetic chaos and centuries of dynastic anxiety. Let's float over to another royal mess. One that makes the Tudors look almost functional. The doomed children of the Stuart dynasty. Because if the Tudors specialized in executions and annulments, the Stuarts preferred civil wars and exiles. And naturally, their children ended up right in the middle of it. Charles I of England was the kind of king who probably would have been fine as a private citizen. He was polite, artistic, soft-spoken, and completely unsuited to ruling a country full of angry Puritans with muskets. His biggest mistake? Believing that divine right meant anything to people who had already decided God probably hated kings. By the 1640s, England was tearing itself apart. Parliament versus monarchy. Cavaliers versus Roundheads. The English Civil War. And Charles's family? Right in the middle of the storm. He and his French Catholic wife, Henrietta Maria, had 9 children. Yes, 9. which was impressive, considering that Charles spent most of his reign fighting wars and dodging political disasters. His children grew up shuttled between castles, safe houses, and foreign courts, never quite knowing if their father would be alive or executed. Spoiler, it's the latter. When Charles I was beheaded in 1649, it wasn't just the end of a king. It was the destruction of a family. His eldest son, the future Charles II, was 18 years old. He was living in exile in France, surviving on the charity of relatives and the vague hope that one day the monarchy might come back. And it's weirdly easy to forget how hard exile actually was. Charles II spent his youth as a royal vagabond. He slept in barns, borrowed money from anyone with a pulse, and learned how to charm people just enough to keep eating. It was a royal education in humility. And it would serve him well when he eventually got his throne back. But let's linger on his siblings for a moment, because they're the ones who really show what it meant to be a royal child of a traitor. His sister Mary married the Prince of Orange, William II of the Netherlands. She was smart, dutiful, and unlucky. She died of smallpox at 29, leaving behind a baby son, future William III of England, who would one day overthrow his own uncle. Because royal family trees are basically just revenge loops with better outfits. Then there was James, the younger brother, eventually James VI. He grew up in exile too, filled with bitterness and probably too many sermons about divine right. He got his throne after Charles II's death and then promptly lost it because he couldn't resist forcing Catholicism on a Protestant country. He fled, naturally, and left his infant son, James Francis Edward Stuart, the Old Pretender, to become the rallying symbol for generations of failed uprisings. And if you think that's messy, wait until you hear about little Henry, Duke of Gloucester. He was only 8 when his father was executed. The new Republican government, under Oliver Cromwell, offered to let him live in peace if he swore not to recognize his brother Charles as king. He refused. He was a child, and he refused. They kept him locked away until they decided he was harmless enough to release. By the time the monarchy was restored, Henry was in his early 20s. He caught smallpox and died before he could even enjoy being a prince again. There's something especially sad about that. Surviving the political chaos, the imprisonment, the endless uncertainty, only to die of something as mundane as smallpox. But that's royal history in a nutshell. The grand stage of human power reduced to random biological chance. The children of Charles I were born into luxury, scattered by war and marked forever by their father's execution. Some rebuilt their lives in palaces, others vanished quietly into history. But they all carried the same shadow, the legacy of the king who believed too much in his own divine right to live. And speaking of tragic royal children raised in impossible circumstances, let's drift eastward to France. Because if the English invented constitutional monarchy, the French perfected the art of royal catastrophe. France in the 18th century was basically a slow-motion disaster movie. Decades of debt, bad harvests, and courtly excess had turned public opinion against the monarchy. And in the middle of it all were the royal children, born in Versailles, raised by servants, and completely unaware that the entire country wanted them gone. Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette had 4 children, 2 daughters, 2 sons. Only one would live to adulthood. Their eldest daughter, Marie-Thérèse, nicknamed Madame Royale, was born in 1778. She was doted on by her parents, adored by the court, and given the kind of childhood that revolutions are built to destroy. By the time she was 11, the French Revolution had begun. By 14, she was a prisoner in the Temple Tower. By 17, she had watched her entire family die. Her younger brother, Louis Charles, became the so-called Louis XVII after his father was executed. He was 8 years old. The revolutionaries locked him in a small cell, cut him off from everyone, and left him to waste away. He died 2 years later, alone, sick, and forgotten. He was 10. When royalists finally inspected his body, they found scars, signs of neglect, and the unmistakable evidence of slow starvation. It's horrifying in a quiet, matter-of-fact way, because here was a child, too young to understand politics, too innocent to rebel, punished for being born royal. Marie-Thérèse was eventually released from prison after the Reign of Terror ended. She was the only one left. She spent the rest of her life in exile, quietly carrying the memory of a family that had vanished into history. She married her cousin because of course she did, and lived into her 70s, still haunted by the ghosts of Versailles. There's a strange peace in her story, though. After years of captivity, loss, and displacement, she somehow survived. She didn't rebuild a dynasty. She didn't seize a throne. She simply endured. And that, perhaps, is what all these children of traitors have in common. Whether born in palaces or prisons, they learned early that royal blood is less a blessing than a warning. Hey everyone. Welcome back to another one of those softly tragic, mildly disgusting, yet oddly comforting bedtime tales from history. Tonight, we're sinking into a story that smells, well, frankly terrible. So go ahead, dim the lights, fluff your pillow, maybe light a candle that smells like literally anything except medieval French court, and settle in. Because tonight, we're talking about the people who refuse to bathe. And not just any people. The elite, perfumed, and profoundly unwashed nobility of Renaissance Europe. Now, the Renaissance was supposed to be this glorious rebirth of art, knowledge, and human greatness. You've seen the paintings, flowing gowns, marble statues, golden halls. But here's the thing. Most of those masterpieces were painted by people who hadn't seen soap since birth. These were the same nobles who'd commission portraits of themselves as Greek gods, and then die of lice-related infections. Let's drift gently into this world, where smelling like roses was considered suspiciously French, and washing your body was believed to open the door to disease. The cleanliness paradox. So first, a gentle reminder of the general European vibe around, say, the 15th and 16th centuries. Everything looked fancy, but everything reeked. Perfume was everywhere, because water was nowhere. You see, for the Renaissance mind, water wasn't this refreshing, life-giving substance we now associate with spa days and hydration goals. No, water was dangerous. A liquid Trojan horse of disease. And the doctors, if we can call them that, were convinced of it. According to them, when you bathe, your pores open up. And once those pores are open, the air gets in. And the air, also known as miasma or bad air, was thought to carry every sickness from plague to gout to just general bad vibes. So, logically, at least to them, keeping your pores sealed shut was the best form of health insurance. Soap, only for the hands. Water, only for the brave. The royal stink, a brief tour. Let's start with France, because of course we do. King Louis XIV, the so-called Sun King, was known for his elaborate fashion, extravagant palace, and his absolutely horrifying body odor. This was a man who ruled from Versailles, a place with 2,300 rooms and not a single functioning bathroom in sight. The palace had maybe a few chamber pots per floor, and let's just say plumbing was more of a suggestion. Louis reportedly bathed twice in his entire life. 2. That's not a joke. And both times were under medical supervision, as though he were undergoing experimental surgery. His doctors firmly advised against bathing, warning him it could make him ill. So instead, he just changed clothes. A lot, like several times a day. Because in the 17th century, changing your linen was believed to clean you, kind of like dry cleaning your soul. The idea was that the linen absorbed all your impurities, sweat, dirt, sin, whatever. Just swap the shirt and voila, purified. Versailles was, in essence, the world's most luxurious laundry basket. Perfume the noble's invisible armor. Now you might be thinking, surely someone noticed the smell? Oh, they noticed, but they dealt with it the noble way, by attacking it with perfume until their bodies were basically flammable. Perfume wasn't just for wrists and necks, it went everywhere. Gloves, wigs, handkerchiefs, even the furniture got spritzed. The French nobility basically weaponized fragrance. Courtiers competed to out-scent one another, creating a social hierarchy based on who smelled the least human. If you ever wondered why so many Renaissance paintings show people holding flowers to their faces, it wasn't an aesthetic thing. It was survival. That rose wasn't symbolic. It was a biological mask. Bathhouses. From leisure to disease hubs. Let's glide over to Italy, because if anyone in Europe might have had better hygiene, it would be the Italians, right? Rome had ancient baths, aqueducts, fountains. Civilization itself was built on the Roman bathhouse. Well, about that. By the late Middle Ages and early Renaissance, public bathhouses had gone out of fashion. Not because people didn't enjoy them. Oh, they did. But because the church and the physicians teamed up for a moral panic. Apparently, too much bathing led to sin. The bathhouses had turned into social clubs, which turned into brothels, which, in the eyes of the church, turned into portals straight to hell. Add in the plague, and suddenly bathhouses were seen as bubbling cauldrons of moral and microbial corruption. So by 1500, the once great Roman bathing tradition had collapsed into dust and incense. The wealthy retreated to their perfumed chambers, and the poor just didn't have water to begin with. And thus began Europe's 300-year relationship with not bathing, the medical madness. Let's not forget the physicians. If there's one thing early modern doctors loved, it was confidently misunderstanding how the human body works. Their logic went something like this. The skin has pores. The pores let out vapors. If you bathe, the pores open. The bad air enters. You die. Flawless reasoning. One French physician, Laurent Joubert, went so far as to say that washing your entire body was a dangerous luxury reserved for the foolish. He warned that water could weaken the brain and make people vulnerable to melancholy, which, to be fair, might explain a lot about European history in general. So instead of washing, nobles were advised to clean themselves by rubbing with dry cloths, changing linens, and occasionally wiping with scented powders. Imagine an entire continent exfoliating with baby powder and denial. England joins the party. Across the Channel, England wasn't much better. Queen Elizabeth IV, the Virgin Queen, the Gloriana, the woman who shaped a whole era, reportedly declared that she bathed once a month whether she needed it or not. Which, let's be honest, is a phrase that really captures the spirit of Tudor hygiene. Her courtiers followed suit. Washing your body too often was for peasants. The English upper class developed a fondness for scented gloves, pomanders, little balls filled with herbs and spices, and an almost religious belief in dry cleansing. If you walked into a Tudor palace, you'd be met with the smell of roses, ambergris, and a faint undertone of medieval armpit. Hair, wigs, and things that lived in them. Then came the wigs. Oh, the wigs. By the late Renaissance and early Baroque periods, noble hygiene had evolved in exactly the wrong direction. Instead of cleaning their hair, nobles shaved their heads and wore massive powdered wigs, perfect nesting grounds for lice, mites, and whatever else nature could invent. Wig powder wasn't just for color or fashion. It was often laced with lavender, orris root, and even lead. Yes, lead, to cover the smell of both the hairpiece and the human underneath. Servants had the unenviable job of maintaining these constructions. They'd air them out, comb them, and occasionally boil them to kill infestations. You could always tell who was new to court life by the scratching, a hint of cleanliness, the exception that proves the rule. Now, not everyone was allergic to water. Some outliers, usually foreign-born, kept bathing traditions alive, much to the scandal of their neighbors. For example, the Moors in Spain and parts of Italy still maintain their ancient Arabic hygiene customs, frequent baths, oils, and public hammams. To Christian Europe, this was both fascinating and deeply suspicious. Cleanliness, to many, had become associated with foreignness, which is how you get a bizarre cultural paradox. Being clean was unchristian, but being filthy meant you were properly devout. You can imagine how the Renaissance smelled. 1 part sanctity, 1 part despair, 3 parts unwashed linen. Let's float now gently toward the next centuries, where science will slowly, painfully rediscover soap, and where royalty will continue to act like bathing is witchcraft. Because yes, even as the Enlightenment dawned, the noble nose remained tragically untested by water. Welcome back, sleepy traveler of history. Let's drift onward through the centuries, past the murky Renaissance, past the reeking corridors of Versailles, into what was supposed to be the Age of Enlightenment. The 1700s promised reason, science, and progress. People were discovering electricity, inventing telescopes, and writing about human rights. But ask any of them to take a bath, and suddenly it was, oh no, that's madness. The Enlightenment was bright, but it didn't smell that way. The clean revolution that never quite happened. So let's set the scene. Paris, mid-18th century. The salons are buzzing with philosophical debate. Voltaire is somewhere being sarcastic. Rousseau is out in the woods being mysterious. And all around them, the air is thick with the perfume of people who still think water is out to get them. Bathing was starting to make a quiet comeback, but not as hygiene, more as an experience. Think of it as the 18th century version of a wellness spa, except you might die. Doctors had started to very carefully reevaluate their anti-water stance. The new theory was that if you bathed in the right kind of water, say warm mineral springs infused with herbs, in a room with no drafts, it might actually be healthy, but only if prescribed by a doctor, and ideally supervised by one too, because you never knew when those pores might betray you. So the wealthy began traveling to spa towns, Bath in England, Baden-Baden in Germany, and Vichy in France. These places became fashionable retreats where people could technically bathe while maintaining the illusion that they weren't doing anything so scandalously clean. The spa as a social stage picture Bath, England, around 1750. Genteel men and women in powdered wigs stroll around the pump room, sipping sulfurous mineral water that smells like rotten eggs. They chat about politics, court gossip, and how their gout is doing. Occasionally they step into the tepid pools, all while pretending it's medicine, not hygiene. Bathing was still considered too intimate to be done casually. So even when people did it, they needed a moral excuse. You couldn't just say, "I feel gross." You had to say, "My physician insists I submerge myself for my humors." And thus, the wellness industry was born. Perfume, from mask to art form. While the doctors were dabbling in hydrotherapy, perfumers were having their golden age. Perfume had evolved from a desperate cover-up to a full-fledged art. In 18th century France, places like Grasse became the beating, oily heart of fragrance production. Flower fields stretched for miles. Workers distilled rose petals, jasmine, and orange blossoms to create the scents that would waft through the powder-white halls of Versailles. Perfume wasn't just personal anymore. It was architectural. People perfumed their walls, furniture, stationery, and wigs. Marie Antoinette famously had a signature blend that followed her everywhere, a cloud of rose, violet, and vanilla. Because when you can't wash, you might as well smell like a pastry. By this point, everyone at court had a signature scent. Entire rooms had smell themes. You could walk into a salon and know who had been there just by the lingering aroma of ambergris or musk. It's like Instagram, but for your nose. Marie Antoinette's soap that she never used. Speaking of Marie Antoinette, she's our next fragrance stop. Now, despite her reputation for luxury, she did own soap. Quite a lot of it, in fact. Custom-made, expensive, hand-scented bars with ingredients like milk and almond oil. But owning soap wasn't the same as using it. The Queen's baths were delicate rituals, performed in a gilded tub surrounded by attendants. She'd sit in scented water for a few minutes, not to wash, but to refresh. No scrubbing, no rinsing, just a symbolic soak followed by powders, perfumes, and layers of silk. Cleanliness was performative. The goal wasn't to be clean, it was to look fragrant and ethereal, like someone who smelled faintly of roses and absolute detachment from reality. And honestly, she succeeded. England smells back. Meanwhile, across the Channel, England was having its own olfactory crisis. London, by the mid-1700s, was a crowded industrial mess. The Thames doubled as a trash can. Chamber pots were emptied into the streets. And yet, the upper classes still thought bathing too often might cause nervous disorders. So instead of water, they embraced linen. Again, clean shirts became the badge of civilization. A gentleman could be covered in dirt, but as long as his collar was white, he was considered spotless. One satirical pamphlet from the time actually mocked the idea of frequent bathing as French vanity. Because if there's one thing the English could never forgive, it was smelling vaguely continental. The Enlightenment's doctors still don't get it. To be fair, science was inching forward. Physicians were beginning to notice that people who washed occasionally seemed less dead. But old beliefs die hard. Even in the late 18th century, medical books still warned that cold water could cause the palsy, the vapors, or rheumatism of the lungs. Warm water, on the other hand, might inflame the blood. Basically, you couldn't win. So the doctors recommended moderation, which in practice meant wash your face, hands, and intimate parts every few weeks. But please, for heaven's sake, keep your chest dry. The scent of royal decay. By the late Enlightenment, the contradiction was everywhere. Intellect and ignorance, candlelight and filth, lace and lice. French nobles powdered their faces with toxic lead, spritzed themselves with gallons of perfume, and believed it all added up to health. The illusion of cleanliness was all that mattered. After all, what was disease compared to fashion? And when the revolution finally came, many of these perfumed nobles found that their hygiene habits had become political. To the revolutionaries, perfume was decadence, scented wigs were oppression, and the smell of soap, that was the smell of the people. It's poetic, really. Centuries of nobles avoiding water only for the guillotine to wash them away in one clean sweep. The slow, soapy dawn. But don't worry, this story doesn't end in grime. By the early 19th century, the tide quite literally began to turn. Industrialization brought plumbing, urban planning brought sewers, and germ theory finally arrived to explain that maybe, just maybe, filth wasn't good for you. The upper classes, ever eager to set trends, flipped instantly. Bathing, once considered dangerous, became a status symbol. Owning a private bathtub was the ultimate luxury. Soap went from suspicious to chic. And suddenly, all those perfumers found themselves repackaging their skills for a new audience. People who wanted to smell clean instead of mask decay. From perfume to purity. By the Victorian era, scent took on a whole new meaning. Cleanliness was next to godliness, and soap ads flooded newspapers with claims of moral and physical purity. The irony, the same aristocratic families who'd once bragged about never bathing were now lecturing the lower classes on hygiene. It's as if centuries of filth had been washed away overnight, and everyone pretended they hadn't been part of the smell in the first place. Let's drift then toward the closing act of our aromatic little journey, where bathing becomes not just fashionable, but moralized. Where soap turns into propaganda and cleanliness finally, gloriously, triumphs, but with that uniquely human twist of hypocrisy. Because of course it does. Welcome back, Night Wanderer. Let's drift now into the 19th century, the era when humanity finally discovered soap and immediately made it weirdly moral. You'd think after centuries of stink, people would just be happy to get clean. But no, the Victorians, being Victorians, turned bathing into a full-blown ideology. Because nothing says civilization quite like aggressively judging someone else's hygiene. The Industrial Revolution, cleanse up. Sort of the 1800s brought steam, steel, and sewers. Cities grew, factories multiplied, and for the first time in European history, running water began to reach homes. Not all homes, of course, let's not get carried away, but enough to start a quiet revolution in cleanliness. Soap was no longer a luxury for queens, it became a product for the masses. The industrial production of soap exploded, thanks in part to a few clever chemists and one unforgettable marketing campaign. Companies like Peers in England and Lever Brothers, later known as Unilever, figured out that soap could be sold, not as something practical, but as something aspirational. You weren't just buying soap, you were buying class. Cleanliness becomes next to godliness. The Victorians loved a moral metaphor, and when they weren't building railways or fainting at ankles, they were writing pamphlets about purity. The church and the state found common ground in soap. Missionaries used it to civilize colonies, and moralists used it to elevate the working class. Clean skin meant a clean soul. Dirty hands meant you were morally suspect. It's as if everyone collectively forgot that their great-grandparents had proudly avoided water like it was radioactive. One popular children's rhyme from the 19th century summed it up neatly. Soap and water are cheap and clean, they keep you pure and fair. For God loves the people who wash themselves and hates the dirty air. Yes, because clearly, divine affection was tied to your access to indoor plumbing. The birth of the bathroom. Let's pause to appreciate how revolutionary the concept of the bathroom really was. For most of human history, bathing meant dragging a bucket of cold water into your room and hoping nobody walked in. But by the mid-19th century, indoor plumbing had crept into the homes of the wealthy. The bathroom became the new status symbol, a private temple of porcelain and polished brass. A place to perform cleanliness, complete with clawfoot tubs, floral soap, and heavy curtains to hide the scandal of one's elbows. Queen Victoria herself had a bathroom installed at Osborne House, complete with a tub and a built-in tap. It was such a novelty that visitors gawked at it like it was a spaceship. By the 1880s, the middle class was catching on. Public bathhouses opened in cities for those who couldn't afford private plumbing. For a few pennies, anyone could rent a towel, soak in a tub, and pretend they were part of polite society. It wasn't just hygiene, it was social mobility in soap form. Pear's soap, the cleanest propaganda on earth. If one product defined this new obsession, it was Pear's soap. Founded in London in the late 18th century, Pear's became famous not for being the best soap, but for being the most aggressively advertised. They practically invented the idea of branding cleanliness. Their ads were everywhere. Newspapers, posters, even fine art prints. And they weren't subtle. A typical Pear's ad might show a cherubic white child holding a bar of soap under a tagline like "The first step toward light." The implication was clear. Clean equals pure, and pure equals superior. It was racist, classist, and smug. In other words, perfectly Victorian. The most infamous Pear's ad of all depicted a black child being washed white with the soap. The caption read, "The Negro's complaint. If Pear's soap will do this, what will it not do?" It was supposed to be funny. Instead, it summarized an entire empire's attitude toward hygiene and morality. Soap as a symbol of cultural dominance. Because what's the point of cleanliness if you can't weaponize it? The Great Unwashed. Of course, not everyone was thrilled about this new hygiene hierarchy. Social critics began using the phrase "the Great Unwashed" to describe the working class. It wasn't about actual cleanliness, it was about class contempt disguised as health concern. A laborer could wash every day and still be sneered at for his calloused hands. Meanwhile, a perfumed noble could forget what water even looked like and still be considered refined. Soap became a way to draw social lines, not erase them. And just like that, something that should have united people under the banner of "please stop smelling awful" became another excuse for division. The empire smells like soap. Victorian Britain, never one to miss an opportunity for moral export, took its hygiene crusade global. Missionaries carried both the Bible and the bar of soap to Africa, India, and the Pacific. Cleanliness was sold as a mark of civilization, and soap was advertised as a tool to uplift unclean peoples. It was all very noble, in the most patronizing way possible. One missionary society even distributed pamphlets titled "Soap and the Savior," explaining that physical cleanliness prepared the soul for spiritual redemption. Because apparently, you couldn't get into heaven if you still smelled like curry or camel. The soap trade, of course, was wildly profitable. The ingredients, palm oil, coconut oil, and other tropical resources, came directly from the colonies that were being cleansed. So in a perfect Victorian twist, the people being told to wash up were the same people supplying the soap. The cult of the morning bath. Back home, bathing became ritualized. The morning bath was now a moral duty. Manuals instructed citizens on how to bathe correctly, with modesty, vigor, and a proper sense of national pride. Men were told to use cold water to toughen their character, women, warm water to maintain feminine delicacy, and children, they were dunked whether they liked it or not. Even schools began installing baths, teaching hygiene alongside arithmetic. Soap was no longer just for the body, it was for the soul, the mind, and the empire. By the late 1800s, even the poor were being pressured to keep clean, not for comfort, but to appear respectable. Because as every Victorian knew, dirt was not just unsanitary, it was immoral. The irony of it all. Here's the funny part. The Victorians congratulated themselves for rediscovering bathing, as if they'd invented it. They had no idea that 1,000 years earlier, Roman citizens were taking daily baths, scrubbing with oils, and debating philosophy in marble steam rooms. Europe had simply taken a millennium-long detour through filth, fear, and perfume, and then proudly returned to the water like it was a new discovery. And of course, they couldn't resist turning it into a competition. Who was the cleanest? Who had the biggest tub? Who used the fanciest soap imported from France? Cleanliness became performance art. The same nobles who'd once powdered their lice-ridden wigs were now soaking in rose-scented tubs, declaring that a clean home reflects a clean conscience. It's almost poetic, if you ignore the hypocrisy. A civilization reborn in soap. By the dawn of the 20th century, the transformation was complete. Bathhouses gave way to private bathrooms. Soap companies became global empires. Hygiene was taught in schools, preached in churches, and marketed in every newspaper. And slowly, the old fears vanished. Nobody talked about miasma anymore. Doctors finally understood germs. Water was no longer seen as dangerous, unless it came out of a London tap, in which case, fair enough. Europe had gone from terrified of bathing to obsessed with it. The pendulum had swung all the way around. The stinking Renaissance noble, the perfumed French courtier, the powdered Victorian, all replaced by the modern human who showers daily and still buys more soap than they'll ever need. Let's float gently now toward our final act, the quiet modern age, where hygiene became not just survival, but identity, where freshness became a corporate religion, and the ghosts of Versailles still whisper faintly through our scented candles and body washes. Because deep down, we're still trying to cover up the same thing. The fear of being human, of being unclean, of being mortal. Hey again, Night Owl. You've made it this far, through centuries of filth, perfume, and moral panic. So let's drift gently into the modern age. The Victorians left us with one powerful legacy: guilt. Specifically, cleanliness guilt. And the 20th century took that guilt, bottled it, mass-produced it, and sold it right back to us in every possible form. Soap, shampoo, toothpaste, deodorant, body spray, detergent, sanitizer, you name it. We may have finally started bathing regularly, but the truth is, we never stopped performing cleanliness. The 20th century, clean becomes corporate. The industrial age was over. The advertising age had begun. Companies like Procter & Gamble, Lever Brothers, and Colgate realized that hygiene products could be marketed not as necessities, but as status symbols. The old Victorian message, "wash to be moral," evolved into "wash to be desirable." By the 1920s, soap wasn't just about health anymore. It was about beauty, success, and romance. Billboards screamed, "Would you let your husband come home to a dull complexion? A woman is only as fresh as she smells." BO, the new social disease. Yes, that's right. Body odor, now abbreviated, commodified, and demonized, was treated as a public emergency. The first deodorant ads didn't even explain what deodorant was. They just said, "You might smell bad," and people are talking about it. Nothing sells like paranoia. The science of smelling clean. By the mid-20th century, the soap bar had gone high-tech. Chemists began adding antibacterial agents, synthetic fragrances, and foaming compounds. Clean no longer meant washed. It meant laboratory approved. Household names like Lifebuoy, Lux, and Dial emerged, each promising a new kind of purity, one backed by science. Lifebuoy even ran radio ads claiming its soap stopped infectious odors. Not bacteria, odors. Because again, the issue wasn't health. It was social acceptability. In this era, smell became identity. The post-war boom created an entire hygiene culture. Fresh towels, tiled bathrooms, pastel soap dishes, and the daily shower routine. Advertisements showed smiling nuclear families bathed in golden light, a bar of soap gleaming like a religious relic. And in a way, it was. The modern bathroom became the altar of the self, from purity to personality. As the decades rolled on, the message changed again. In the 1950s and 60s, personal hygiene merged with individuality. No longer about sin or class, now it was about expression. Perfume became a signature. Shampoo commercials told you to find your scent. Deodorants came in fresh, sport, or ocean breeze flavors. We'd entered the era of olfactory branding. Soap wasn't just soap anymore, it was you. And yet, underneath the bright packaging and the smiling housewives, the same old fear lingered. What if I'm not clean enough? Because the truth is, that's what hygiene marketing thrives on. Anxiety, fear of rejection, fear of odor, fear of other people's noses. If you strip away the slogans and the bubbles, the 20th century's hygiene revolution was just the Renaissance perfume war all over again. Only this time, mass-produced and lemon-scented. The return of water. For the first time in over a millennium, the act of bathing itself became enjoyable again. Hot running water, fluffy towels, scented soaps. An entire generation rediscovered the pleasure of being clean. In America especially, the daily shower became a cultural standard. Morning showers to wake up, evening showers to relax, 2 a day if you're fancy. Europe followed at a slower pace and honestly still debates the schedule. By the 1970s, showers were no longer just for hygiene, they were for mental health. You weren't just washing your body, you were washing your stress. The bath evolved too. No longer the steaming cauldron of plague risk, it became a sanctuary. Candles, bath bombs, oils, echoes of ancient Rome and medieval luxury, but now repackaged as self-care. And if the Victorians could see that, they'd probably faint. Into a lavender-scented bubble bath. Advertising goes sensual. By the late 20th century, the tone shifted again. Clean wasn't just moral or social, it was sexy. Think about those classic soap and body wash commercials from the 80s and 90s. Slow-motion water droplets, laughter in the shower, a hint of saxophone. Somewhere, someone is whispering, "Because you're worth it." Soap had come full circle, from medieval superstition to sensual luxury. The very act of bathing, once considered scandalous, became the ultimate symbol of freedom, beauty, and power. And yet, ironically, all that sensual steam came from the same old fear, being judged for how you smell. We'd perfected the art of clean anxiety, but made it glamorous, the age of overclean. Fast forward to the 21st century, we're cleaner than ever. We have antibacterial everything, soaps, wipes, gels, sprays, even toothbrushes with microsanitizers. And yet, scientists now say we might be too clean. Over-sanitization has led to weakened immune systems, skin issues, and disrupted microbiomes. The bacteria we've spent centuries trying to annihilate, turns out we need some of them. There's even a movement now, the no soap movement, of people who've sworn off commercial cleansers altogether, claiming water alone keeps them fresh and balanced. And honestly, it's kind of poetic. After centuries of filth, centuries of soap, centuries of fear, we've come back around to maybe just water. History doesn't repeat, it rinses and repeats. The luxury of simplicity. Meanwhile, the modern wellness industry has turned cleanliness into a billion-dollar aesthetic. Minimalist packaging, plant-based ingredients, soaps with names like Mountain Calm or Sea Whisper. Each bar promises transcendence, mindfulness, and an unspoken assurance that you're not like those other people, the ones who use chemicals. It's the same moral signaling, just in organic cotton. Even the word clean has been repurposed. Clean eating, clean beauty, clean living. It's no longer about hygiene, it's about identity. To be clean today is to be curated. The long arc of soap. If you trace the story back from your mint-scented shower gel to the marble baths of Rome, you can see the whole arc of human contradiction. We started with fear of water, of disease, of impurity. Then came pride, perfumed nobles who refused to wash. Then guilt, Victorians who equated soap with salvation. Then vanity, modern humans scrubbing to impress each other. Cleanliness has always been less about hygiene and more about hope. The hope that by washing away dirt, we might also wash away something deeper. Shame, sin, anxiety, mortality. No one really likes to admit it, but we've been trying to scrub our souls since the first time someone invented a sponge. Echoes of the unwashed past. Even now, the ghosts of history linger in our habits. Every time you step into a shower and reach for that bottle of body wash that promises freshness that lasts all day, you're repeating a ritual older than you think. The nobles of Versailles did the same, only with perfume instead of citrus-scented gel. The Victorians did it with moral fervor, the Romans did it with pride. And deep down, it's all the same impulse, the dream of renewal. The difference is we finally have plumbing that works. A quiet reflection. So tonight, as you lie there under your clean sheets, surrounded by the faint smell of laundry detergent and lavender, take comfort in knowing that history, for once, is on your side. You are cleaner than 99% of humanity ever was. Your soap wouldn't just impress Louis XIV, it would probably terrify him. He'd see your daily shower routine as an act of reckless self-endangerment. And honestly, that's beautiful. Because in a world that once thought water was poison, every shower you take is a quiet act of rebellion. A tiny, steamy triumph of reason over superstition. So rest easy, my freshly scrubbed listener. You've survived the saga of humanity's greatest paradox, the long, strange, fragrant journey from filth to freshness. And as you drift off to sleep, just remember, we might all still be a little dirty inside, but at least we smell better than the Renaissance.